Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm Matt Hauk with Intake Health, and today I'm very excited that I get to sit down with a great friend, a great mentor, and a legend in the field. Today we get to sit down with Mark McLaughlin. Mark, thank you for joining us. How are you today?
Matt, great to be here. I'm doing awesome, man. Just the fact that it's been 20 years and you and I are here talking is a great thing. So happy to be here.
So what everyone at home should know is that meetings like this are typically over coffee, maybe a pint. In our neighborhood, Mark and I live just a couple miles from each other, and yeah, we've known each other now. It is in fact 20 years now, which is bizarre to think about that you put up with me all this time. But what I want to dive into today here on our Intake Health interview is people know your story about the performance industry, but I want to tell your story in the performance industry from a slightly different lens. I want to pull back the curtain a little bit on some of the experiences that you've had over these 20 years. I joked around earlier that we're going to go scorched earth on strength and conditioning, which might happen, but really what we're going to do is share some insights about your work with athletes over all these years. Number two, how technology was interwoven from your process early on, thoughtfully. And three, how that's evolved to what you're doing today, what's going on today, and maybe talking about some future projects or future trends. So one thing I want to start off with, in your presentations that you've done over the years, and I've seen many of them, some of the other like podcast interviews you've done, some local media outlet work, you talk about the history of like, why did you get involved in sport? And your history as an athlete, what people should know about you is that you were a very competitive athlete in an era where there was a lot of hyper competitiveness, especially amongst like high school sports. You got to play under a legendary Oregon high school basketball coach who's still one of the all-time winningest coaches in this state or any state in basketball under Jack Clayhorn. So I'll name drop there. But that kind of fueled you in terms of your competitiveness. And while Jack was old school in a lot of ways, he was also crafty. He was a thinker. He was methodical about things. And you guys had great success. But then that pushed you into the athletic realm. And even after you finished playing in college, your competitiveness didn't leave you. You got into a competitive field. You were in sales for a while. You know, that's a competitive field. But the competitor and athlete in you didn't go very far because you ended up back in sport. And can you share just a little bit about why did you get back into sport, like mid-late 90s, early 2000s, when you started working with athletes? What was going on then where you said, hey, wait a minute, like this is where I belong, and here's my call to action in this field based on what's going on?
Yeah, so thanks for the introduction there. And, you know, what really kind of drove that early entry into the, you know, strength and conditioning and sport performance field was when I was playing, you know, a sprained ankle was, I think, the worst injury I had or any of the athletes that I played with or watched play, say on the girls' side from different sports. Like it just, you know, these ACLs and all these weird injuries just were not happening. And so, you know, in the late 1990s, I was, you know, sitting at home reading the Oregonian, and there was a lot of prep reporting on these kids that had these like horrific injuries, like a broken femur and, you know, high cases of anemia from one school and, you know, chronic hamstring injuries. And, you know, you would think that it was coming from, say, a sport like football or basketball that had a lot of contact, yet it was the polar opposite, and those were all track and field issues, you know, a non-contact sport. And so just common sense told me that it had to be within that training side. And so at that point, I really started to research, okay, how should they be training or how could they be training? And so then, you know, I learned, I turned on myself to test it out. And, you know, there's a 200-mile bike race or bike tour from Seattle to Portland. And so, I trained myself for that. And, I finished in one day. It took me a little bit over 10 hours. And then I started training myself within weight training. And then at that point, I'm like, okay, I want to take this to the high school level to see if I can now reproduce these results. And that's how I met you. And, fortunately, your coach at the time, Sean Cease, gave me the opportunity to basically have carte blanche over the football program to test that out. And so that's how I got my start. And it really was centered around the health and well-being of the athlete and allowing them to compete in sports that they loved, that keeping them healthy to play was the top priority. And then that just kind of snowballed from there on how we manage training, how I talk to athletes. And so that was the start. And so that was my, entree into getting into the field and why I got into it.
One thing that I would really like people to know about those early days. So being on that first team that you were working with, very quickly after that, Performance Training Center opened up. And those earliest days at Performance Training Center, you and I have spoken about this because those earliest days were electric with the athletes that were coming there. First and foremost, they were coming there for a reason. They wanted to get better, which is typical of anyone who might seek those services out. But particularly at that time, there were a lot of athletes that were headed to Performance Training Center that not just wanted to get better, but they weren't getting it from anywhere else. In fact, we were hearing stories from what athletes were forced to do by their coaches, their sports coaches. So they forget the fact if they had a strength coach at all at that time. It was their sports coach, their club coach that was having them do fitness testing or conditioning or whatever it might be. And then, as you know, some of the coaches that I had at various times were implementing performance training that on the face of it seemed a little strange, but certainly when you got into the weeds of it and saw the result of it, it was bad. It was poor. It was literally taking me the other way. And I remember early on, the phrase that was coined at the gym was, "Hey, we get you results, period." That was the t-shirt. Like it's right. But that is what it was about. And what happened in the earliest days, every athlete that came in there, whatever sport they were involved in, obviously we had a lot of football players, but every sport that they were involved in and every athlete that came there was objectively improving across many measures, across many areas of weight training, jumping, sprinting. And then from a fitness standpoint, we saw results. We drank the Kool-Aid early on, but you said, "Hey guys, like, I'm glad that you were improving here, but remember, you got to go back to your sport. You got to be able to play your sport, but you're going to go back into this environment. You got to be prepared for those demands." And you listen, with all the stuff you deal with those coaches, like a lot of us struggle with coaches at different sports because it felt like everything that we were doing outside of the gym was counterproductive. Then we'd come back to the gym and we were just broken down over time. We'd broken down over a season, or we'd do off-season conditioning and just be torched and come back. But then you laid down the ultimatum and said, "Guys, if you ever want this to improve, it's not just enough to train. And two, it's not just enough to complain about it. It's up to you to change what happens. You have to become the strength coach. You have to become the sports coach. Go educate yourself, continue to train, get out there and have experience. And then you have to have a positive impact on that next generation coming forward." And one thing that I wanted to bring up is that for those that don't know, Mark McLaughlin has now trained into the thousands of athletes over the last 25 years or so, right? That have spanned not just junior high, high school, every level of college, from NAIA all the way up to Division I. He's had athletes go on to play in the NFL. He's worked with athletes in the NBA, Major League Baseball, professional soccer. He's also expanded, and that's just here domestically. What else he's done in North America? He's worked with the tactical population. He's worked with special operators and special forces. He's worked with with FBI SWAT team members. So he's got an expansive resume of athletes he's worked with. But One thing that people should also know about the athletes that Mark has worked with and some of his former staff members, that advice that he gave those athletes, he's had quite an impression upon people he's worked with, because former athletes of Mark's have gone on to become physical therapists, strength and conditioning coaches at multiple levels of sport, at the professional level, the collegiate level. They've gone on to become head coaches at the high school level, JUCO level. Some of his athletes got into medicine. They're in med school. They're doctors. They got into academia, became professors in physical education or elsewhere in our fields. They've gone on to become dietitians, educators at the high school level, coaches at the high school level, obviously. Other gym owners. Like, he's had a tremendous impression upon those people. So I had to toot your horn for a moment, Mark, but that leads me to my next question of, okay, early on, those are the seeds you planted, and it clearly had an impression upon people, right? Talk about how things evolved, because when you think of the earliest days of programming at Performance Training Center, like, this is early 2000s, and for people who've been in strength and conditioning a long time, you know, this is a callback to Louis Simmons, Westside Barbell, loud music, getting after it, having a blast. Everyone was improving, sprinkling in some Charlie Francis sprint work. Like, that was like almost basically version 1.0 of what we were doing. We were getting tremendous results, but you didn't stick with that programming. You took the best bits over time. You kept learning. You kept evolving the programming that went on there. You kept evolving the support that athletes got within the gym, without the gym. Talk to me about, with the evolution of your programming, especially through those first like 4 to 8 years of Performance Training Center, from PTC 1.0 in a basement in Northeast Portland to PTC 2.0 down off, was that International Way here in Milwaukee?
Yeah.
And 3.0 out in Beaverton. Like, talk to me about what your mindset was in those early days of evolving your program. What was the litmus test for you to go, I need to evaluate what we're doing right now, because I'm learning something, it's evolving. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So, first off, I mean, Louis Simmons and Charlie Francis like had a huge impact on my learning process. Jim Wendler and Dave Tate at Elite Fitness, like, hugely influential in, spending the time with me on the phone. Okay. I can remember having conversations with, Jim Wendler. And, like, just because, I don't do a lot of media, just because, like, people don't want to talk to the guy with the bald head. But, Jim was, had a big impact on me early on. And so did Dave. And, later on, they gave me a chance to, actually, be on the virtual staff of Elite Fitness. And early on, it was, a West Side strength template with jumping. And then it was a Charlie Francis speed and tempo. And that's how actually a lot of us at that time were learning. If you look at how Buddy Morris and Tom Myslinski learned, they were heavily influenced by Louis and other people. And so that's how we learned. And so that system at the beginning, like, that's what we used. The thing at the beginning was I also invested in Omega Wave, which, you talk about polar opposites of, Louis and West Side, where, unless your heart has stopped beating, you're going to train. And then Omega Wave, where it's like, okay, we're gonna test your readiness to see if you are ready to train. And so it was a conflict of the systems, which it wasn't a bad thing, but that's how I started. And then with Omega Wave and testing you guys before training sessions, like, that was like a big step in, like, what are we doing here? Like, what do you mean I'm not ready? What do you mean my parasympathetic nervous system is overreaching, or, I'm sympathetic dominant? I mean, those were foreign words to me, even though I bought the system. Like, at the beginning, I didn't know a lot of that stuff, and I had to learn about it. And listening to Louis, reading what Louis had written, I learned about Yuri Verkhoshansky. I learned about Zadzorsky. I learned about different Eastern Bloc coaches. Okay, so my wife will say I'm OCD, which is absolutely true. So my nature, it just drove me to go down these rabbit holes. And I would go down those rabbit holes and I would learn, and then I would bring it back to the gym and say, okay, this is what we're going to do and why we're going to do it. And I had, some great test subjects. I had exceptional athletes like yourself and, other people that were in the facility at the time where we could test it out. And that's how that evolution of the training methodology and how I applied it started. So, and then I had conversations with the owner of Omega Wave, Val Nasedkin, of different tests that we could start doing on top of Omega Wave. So, if you remember, we would test, vertical jump or standing long jump, for the neuromuscular system. And okay, it's down by this much, so we're going to adjust the volume and intensity this much. And so I learned that we may have a program written for that day. It's going to change based on how the athlete is ready to train on that given day. So, that's why we would see these productive sessions maybe once a week. But then as the fitness grew and we got more of it, okay, it was 2 times a week and say 3 times a week. And just the age that you guys were at that time, the results came rapidly because we were doing things, I think, in a proper manner. I was never satisfied, though. Like, I was constantly trying to figure out, okay, what and why am I doing this? Okay, now that doesn't make sense. I would learn more about the sport, the physiology. Okay, now we're going to change things up. And here are the reasons why, based on, sound science at the time. And that's why Yuri Verkhoshansky at that time, once I started learning about him more, was like hugely influential. But it took time for me to understand what he was saying. Because I can remember, and man, I'm old for saying this, but I had to check books out of the library. And with his books, like nobody had them. So it came from the interlibrary loan system from Denver, Colorado. And I can remember vividly the book came in and I can't wait to get down to the library. And, he's going to have all this training programs written out and everything. And I pick the book up and I walk outside and I'm flipping through it. And holy shit, man, it's theory. It's stuff that was like way over my head. And I did a 180, went back in the library and turned that book back in because I didn't understand it, and it didn't have those training templates.
What's funny is that something that's not often shared, but speaking of like the Russian texts, I remember like hunting in the Portland State Library in the basement because there's like the Soviet Sports Review or something like that. It was like,
oh yeah.
And you sent me looking for it, and I think that they had some. They had it there. But then learning some of these names of Zadzorsky, Verkhoshansky, some of the few American counterparts from 70s, 80s, 90s who were like, hey, these Russians, like, yeah, sure, there's probably drugs in there. Yeah, but they have a super in-depth understanding of what they're doing. Like people like Dr. Yesis, who was one of the early people who would say, hey, America, like, yeah, there are mortal enemies right now. This is still Cold War era. And yeah, sure, there's drugs, absolutely. But guess what? There's drugs in America too. And they have such a fine understanding of developing athletes with so many less resources, like systemically. I'm going to say resources lightly because obviously they put a lot of time and effort on that side of the wall into sport and physical culture. But over here, we've got many millions more people that all have access to sport, and it's kind of like a survivorship. It's survival of the fittest here, as opposed to like truly producing those athletes with
Yeah.
less social equity on hand, let's say. And you could debate about that, and I welcome that. But those big names from Russia, from the Soviets, that, like it or not, are those concepts from all of those researchers, shock training, different type of weightlifting blocks, etc., wove their way into things that are so common now that we don't think twice about them. And for a while, you remember some of the early naysayers, and naysayers continue to come up along the way, like, oh, that guy who's he's pretending to do all those Russian things. All those Russians were on drugs. I'm going to dismiss all that. He's just a bunch of crazy. But then, like, all of the athletes at your gym were doing tremendously well. You went down those rabbit holes. You learned and continued reading. I remember, hanging out with some of the athletes, and you were just like, you're halfway through a textbook, and then you made some joke about, God, I wish I would have studied this hard in college or something like that.
Right.
But you gained such a mastery in those areas and implemented them so well that there was a time where didn't Verkhoshansky's family at one point ask you to help review a translation of one of his training doc. One of the last things that he ever published, I think. He asked you, or the family asked you to kind of review one of the translations. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's ironic, isn't it? So it was on middle distance running.
Mhm.
And so I think James Smith did a lot of that. I did some of it. And then another coach, Mark Bennett, who's in the rugby field. So the three of us, had a hand in that. And and then also, having, Val Nasedkin as a resource early on was, again, man, him, Landon Evans, and some other outsiders, but, those two, some of the other scientists, but then also, the athletes I was able to apply this to, like, hugely influential. And Val, the seminar he gave in 2007, so if we're talking about kind of the iteration of my training methodologies and everything, like in 2007, we had that seminar at PTC, and 2 days of Val lecturing on his, methods, how he tested them out with Omega Wave, he tested them out at the highest level. And, it was like, I think we had maybe 12 people there. And I think probably 6 of them I invited that were freebies. And that seminar changed the course of our understanding of training to the point where, like, I think the next day, me, Landon, you, probably some other coaches, like, we wrote everything we've been doing with Westside, Charlie Francis, whatever, wrote it up on the board. We erased it because we were done with that. And we started, with those methods and ideas from Val. And that was like, you probably only have a few of them in your coaching career. That was one of those weekends and days where it's like totally changed. It was like the impact even today is still felt.
It's almost akin to surely a Pandora's box moment.
Absolutely.
Now that we've seen it at least presented this way, I remember our thinking had totally been challenged of, like, it doesn't fit into these specific templates. And then obviously what came after that is you all are doing this right now. Like, you all are going to experience it. We looked at some of the training prescriptions and some of the areas of focus, some of the constraints that we'd be up against, some of the thought process about, well, it's not just you squatting. Like, it's not just your muscles getting stronger. We need to think about the system that supports muscles getting stronger. We need to also think about the system that supports muscles getting stronger, strong enough to tolerate a certain frequency of training to be able to train harder and then training harder to be able to compete at certain levels at certain like they basically took every bigger, faster, stronger Nebraska football from that day, all the little manuscripts and all the little neat little spreadsheets of do 3 by this and this and that, this is all you need to do, and it set it all on fire. And as we immersed ourselves and then felt what I like to term as wholesale changes in how we felt as an athlete, how that changed our physical being, how that changed our psyche, that to me was the biggest, breath of fresh air about everything, but was also like a shocking bolt to the system of, oh my goodness, this, I feel physically different every time I walk in and train. You go all sorts of different dark, crazy places, especially with some of those heavy training days, with some of those infamous, not just the oxidative squats, but some of like the sequences that we would be doing for capacity of like, oh my goodness, like this is some serious volume, and it takes real mental toughness, if you want to use that term, to even be able to prepare to do something like that. That changed everything for me. And so then, as someone who was impressed upon and mentored by you, I was also one of the people that fit into that population of trying to go out and make a difference and pay it forward as a strength coach or sports scientist or sports coach in particular. I just remember thinking to myself, like, this has got to be a golden nugget that's taken when I approach anything. And then obviously I went on to other environments, worked for other coaches, other teams and team settings. And I was still so impressed upon like that aha moment of, wow, like I have never felt this way as an athlete. And I've never thought this way as a coach or practitioner in terms of organizing things. With that, we talk about technology a little bit. You were way ahead of the curve in using technology, first and foremost. Obviously, you had influencers at that time, Val Zetkin being one of them, of saying, listen, you really need to think about training process differently, and the athlete responds to that. And so all of a sudden, there's some technology woven in. You were monitoring athletes and how they were responding to training very early on. Omega Wave wasn't the only piece of technology that you were using. We had a Tendo unit early on. We were using timers, obviously, and then the good old, tape measure. With technology use, I think maybe I'm a great example to dive into my example of my exposure to technology, because my question centers around this: the art and the science of using technology in athlete monitoring. What is your mindset all of these years later, knowing that you're still using different forms of different technologies with some of the work you're doing now, which I'd really like to dive into as well? What is your thought and mindset on the process of the art and science of athlete monitoring via sports technology?
Yeah. So I think I'll start at the beginning with you, because I think that's a great place to start. Is the main reason I got Omega Wave was I wanted to look after player and athlete health and well-being. And I felt like I needed some technology that would embody that message. From, okay, this is my message to the athlete, externally, to the parents, to the coaches, and here's how I'm backing it up on the backside. And with you at the start, it's like, okay, we have this piece of technology, we're going to start testing you, and I'm going to start learning about, and this is where I really started to learn about taking those readings at the beginning of a session, and which is the objective view, and then, okay, subjectively, now how does this go into the training and how we're going to change it? And that got back to then me asking a ton of questions. And so with you, it's like, okay, we're going to hook you up to the Omega Wave, and here are the results. And you would come out of a heavy loading period of, I don't know, 3-4 years, let's say, maybe longer, where you were doing a lot of work, a lot of middle ground work, and were exhausted. And, your performance results, kind of prove that out. And your demeanor, like all that stuff was saying to me, just from a uneducated observer, that something is not right. And then the technology, as you and I know, kind of backed that up. And to make a long story short, there were 6 months of testing you daily, sometimes twice a day, to get you out of that. And, I don't know if there's a true term of overtraining. You were the closest that I've ever had. And it took us that long to get you out of that. And it was very holistic on how we did it. And there were times when you and I would look at the results, see how you're feeling, and say, okay, like, you should go for a walk today. You should lift 95 pounds for bench, which I think at the time your best was like 200 or something. And we're just going to keep it easy. We're like, man, that's not training in the true sense of how we view training. Okay, we're going to stick with this. And over time, we saw, okay, your 40 time was 5'1" when we started this thing. Okay, you then fast forward 8 months to PSU tryouts. Okay, Matt runs a 4.4 and a 4.3. Okay, that's improvement. Like, I think anybody nowadays would take that. But if they heard on what we did to get to that point, they wouldn't believe us. So I had to write an article about it. Your strength, like all of these things began to improve because we were listening to you as the individual on how you were responding to whatever stress you were undertaking at that time. And then we were using the Tendo unit within those training sessions later on to monitor your readiness and auto-regulation. People use that now like it's some new term, but it's not. Velocity-based training was introduced to me by Louis Simmons. Like, that's where I learned about the Tendo unit. So we invested in a couple, and that's how we started using it. And so we were doing those training sessions, monitoring that as well, on top of Omega Wave and on top of other things. And then over time, and especially after Val's seminar, the understanding of what your biological systems were performing at based on that test was one thing. Now the development of those systems was the training that we were doing, getting us the right stimulus and adaptations seen on those, the HRV. So then that changed the way that we looked at how we prescribed training. It changed on how we prescribed recovery, how we managed load. And at that time, when I was writing on different websites and talking to people, they had this idea that we wouldn't go hard if people were yellow or red. It was all like this, like easy training. And on those days, absolutely, we would adjust it. On the green days, though, which came more often than not, like the training was hard based on what the individual needed and could handle. And that's how we kept out of injury issues. That's why the performance, not only in the training hall, on the field was improving. And then the overall well-being of the person was evolving. And then that's where the art comes in. Matt, how are you feeling? How do you feel today? How do your muscles feel? How did that set feel? Okay, here's the video of you squatting. Here it is of running. So then this art of it, like me asking questions constantly, this feedback. Okay, this is how Matt, my perception of how he looks when he's feeling great. Here's how Matt walks when he's not. So then I begin to the art of it, observing people, like talking very little, observing one or two questions, very pointed, feedback from the athlete, and then you move on. And that's why, to me, the human aspect of the training really kind of overrode at times what the objective was. Because, like, you know, the human being is such a, fragile at times, yet resilient at times, that you really have to take that into account. And then the mental aspect of it and everything else that's going on outside. And then the competitiveness within the gym, like, because we never had any alphas really, like everyone was there to help everybody else. So then that developed this culture of everyone looking out for each other. Because we would have Super Bowl champions like Kevin Boss training in there, Owen Marisic, you playing at a high level in college, and then I'd have junior high kids, high school kids, that they weren't the best athletes, but they wanted to be there, yet everyone was on this equal ground. And so that just lent itself to this continual progress of the culture within the system, which then drove me to constantly wanting to think about, is this the best way to do it? And I needed always objective feedback to, give me a perspective. Because, the training I did with you was far different on how I was preparing Owen. And the way that, and, I wrote a 3-article series on it, Less is More, with you, Owen, and Kevin as examples. For everybody had a different reason on why I adjusted that. So yes, it was the objective side, but then it was also on the, art side of it. And then technology now to this point. So, still use HRV, obviously, because I see the importance of it. But now with things like, the Moxie and muscle oxygen, like, lactate is one thing, and that was the one thing that people used a lot of. We never did, because I always felt it was too invasive. But now with like Moxie, like in real time, like you can now see, what's happening at the working muscle. And are rest periods too long or not long enough for certain athletes? Are we getting the right physiological response at that working muscle with those two factors? So, SMO2 and THB within that training session. Okay, the tempo run that people say, okay, run it. Charlie was always, 75% of your best time from a velocity standpoint, or, Vern Gambetta in his book for extensive tempo, I think is like 20 to 22 seconds. Okay, so I've put the Moxie on people along with heart rate monitor and had them run at those speeds. And for certain populations, it's just too hard. The heart rate is way too high. The SMO2 values are going down too hard and not recovering how I want them to. So the training session is, from an adaptation standpoint, for the sport they're playing, for the age they're at, like it's totally wrong. Okay, now we need to slow down. Now we need to increase the rest period. So now you have this even more precise in training feedback loop that, we just didn't have before. You put that on top of HRV, you put that on top of, say, some velocity-based training, and now the athletes are really getting an individualized training program, which then goes back to, we are athlete-centered. Here's how we are embodying that from both objective and subjective. And then it's athlete by, so all these things downstream are so positive that then the art of coaching becomes, more of a factor as well.
What I really appreciate about that approach is that you did not implement technology searching to solve a problem. Rather, you had a really fine understanding of reality and the ecosystem you were in and what the challenges of the athlete were faced with. And you said, okay, is there a tool or something I need to learn to better support this problem solving? So you didn't put the cart before the horse. And certainly modern times, with how prevalent sports technology is, how accessible it is, how interesting it might be, we're certainly all guilty to some degree of going, hey, let's put the cart before the horse and see how fast we can push it. You've really never taken that approach. You had a firm understanding of what was going on with the athlete, the process, and the goal. And then with a lot of nuance, implemented different types of technology that were very specific to a process. I've always appreciated that historically, obviously, and that had an impression upon me during, years later when I was implementing technology in different teams or with different athletes. And even in my work now, where I work with technology companies, and I go, hey, let's think about the problem differently. What are we actually solving?
And I think so when I started PTC, so it was a business, right? So, I had bills to pay, I had rent, all of this stuff. The thing that drove it wasn't the training, or the business wasn't driving the training was driving the business. And from a business standpoint, wasn't the smartest thing, but that's the way that we were going to do it. We never had a 45-minute speed session. We never had a, hour, strength or cardio session. Okay, we had half an hour to 2 hour training sessions. Like, we were going to come there to train, no matter how long it took. Mm-hmm. And so I think that lent itself to, this is a process. If it takes 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, that's how long it's going to take. You cannot speed this stuff up. And that's the issue where people get hurt, people get injured. They try to rush things. They try to force these adaptations on kids and they can't handle it. So they break down, even though they're young. And so with me, it's like, man, I want to do everything I can to get each athlete to their highest level at the latest stage of their career. And then give them a love for training and exercise and sport that carries on till, they're in their 80s or 90s. That was always in the back of my mind. And today it's like even more so because of the ultra competitiveness of youth sport, which ironically is, not producing the best athletes.
So let's talk about that, because I'd like to dive in and share a little bit about some of the work you're doing right now and how some of the work you're doing at this moment, I'll let you share it, is the culmination of all the work that you've done the past 2 decades that is now going to continue on with the goals in mind of, with all the programming or the tools that we use, it has to serve what's best for the athlete, as you just mentioned. You want to share a little bit about what you're doing now and some of the goals of that?
Yeah. So 3 years ago, Stevie Corey came to me, and Stevie, not a lot of people, know his stories, but anyway, I trained Stevie after high school to get him ready to go to Oregon State because he was preferred walk-on with the football team as a wide receiver. And, I had great success with him. He, his first year down there, he was the second fastest on the team. I think he ran a 4.34 electronic, and the only person faster than him was Brandon Cooks, who was the number 1 draft choice. And I don't know if those times are right, regardless. So then when Stevie found out that I was starting my consulting business again, he reached out to me and said, hey, would you ever want to coach at the high school level again? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if I want to do that. I haven't done it in a while. I don't know if I can do it. And he's like, hey, just meet with my dad. And his dad, Steve Corey, is the head coach at Lake Oswego, has had huge success there. Steve's dad, Dick Corey, was, coached in the NFL for many years. And so I'm like, okay. And I had known Steve for, a little bit. And so I met with him. He said, hey, how do you feel about working with the football team? And I gave him kind of the same thing that I had given to Stevie. And so I'm like, I'll get back to you. So I came home and talked to my wife. And then I'm like, okay, we decided I would, give it a shot. And, looking back on it now, it was hands down the best thing, one of the best opportunities that I've had. Because Steve Corey, not only is he a football savant and his staff is like incredible, he's just a great person. And so the culture that he had in place there was, bar none. And so at that point, then I started working with the football team. And then I took a 15-hour-a-week job monitoring the weight room. But always when I took that job, it wasn't a monitoring job. It was, okay, I'm going to start training different sports that want to train with me. And so I started working with girls and boys lacrosse, girls basketball, obviously the football team, the baseball team. I worked with the dance team there. And, I started introducing them to obviously, proper training methodology and planning, monitoring. I started with a questionnaire first off, that Landon had built for me, and, had good success and interest within the athletes. They're doing that. And I've learned over the years, and then my time working with Omega Wave, that like technology should be kind of brought into things slowly, because, the kids have to buy into the training first. And as you know, there's a lot of college and pro teams that buy technology, but then, they can't even write a good training program. So, they kind of get the cart before the horse there. And so I started implementing that. Then I went to HRV. I picked a couple athletes who would give me good feedback on its usage, the ease of it. We started changing training based on that. Then I gave a presentation to the team after like 6 months of them using it. Used the 2 examples with these athletes. The buy-in was good. And then, the training process continued to be refined. And, we probably started at the beginning with the football team at, say, 40 athletes. And now with all those teams there at Lake Oswego, we probably have 100 to 150 plus, depending on the time of year. And now we use the Moxie there as well. But then that job then turned into me working for the district. And right now I work at Lake Ridge High School and Lake Oswego High School. And at Lake Ridge now I'm fortunate to work with the ski team and girls basketball. So now taking what I've implemented at Lake Oswego to then try to take this culture and implement it at the other high school. Now at Lake Oswego, I have 8th, 7th, 6th, and 5th graders that train within our system as well. And it's the culture there that Steve had developed was awesome. The other teams have the same way that they handle things. And so now it's developing this culture of training. So they had it on the sports side, but now how do we turn it back into the physical training? And that takes time. And my goal through learning a ton, whether it be from, our conversations over coffee, with, Landon, who, for both of us, especially for me, I won't talk for you, but like he's been, just a wealth of knowledge on application of training, application of technology, best practice, and then taking, what he has taught me and then scaling it down to the athletes that I'm working with. And then also learning from some other sports scientists that are, people wouldn't think that the sport of triathlon or cross country skiing, has any, place in, say, power speed sports. But when you listen to these coaches and scientists talk, man, they have some great insights. So Oyvind Sandbach, Olav Alexander Boo, who is the head of, or who coaches, the two best triathletes in the world now. And like how they went through these processes, how they built the culture. So take away the science of it, like how our culture is built, and then bring science back into it and how they use that to reinforce this athlete-centered approach. And that was always the thing with talking with Landon, like, his caring for these athletes. And the one thing that stuck in my mind with one of our conversations was, man, as long as the athlete is coming back smiling, like I know I've done my job. And when you look back at your time at PTC, like you were talking about early on, how I thought about, the athletes that I work with there, like, man, there was a joy in what we were doing. And so that, at the end of the day, like the human aspect of how you are doing is more important than, the sporting result. And, that's probably why you and I are, have built this friendship over 20 years.
Yeah, we've remarked recently, probably more over the last couple of years, obviously, with just what's been going on in the world.
Yeah.
We've been more reflective of just how special of an environment that was created, that, as I mentioned at the start of our conversation together, had an impression upon so many people that they not only continue to do well, not only did they continue to come back to gym or come back to train with you in some capacity, there was enough of an impression upon them that they said, I love this. I want to stay in this. I made a career somehow out of this. So these years. And as I mentioned down, you have people across every portion of sport or high performance, health and performance, however you want to think of it, and athletic training, physical therapy, nutrition, dietitian, it's sports science, strength and conditioning, sports coaches, educators, doctors. Like, you have put people out there because of the environment that you created, the process that you created at Performance Training Center years and years ago. And now, all these years later, not to make us sound old, gosh, I shouldn't say that out loud. It kind of makes us sound old. What you're doing now is creating a whole new generation of athletes that are coming back. And in fact, you've also mentioned one of the coaches at Lake Oswego was a former athlete of yours. And now I'm talking about full circle. Like, now she is heading up the women's basketball team there.
Yeah.
Who's the coach again?
Kate Childs. Yeah. And actually, Landon, so Kate came to us when we were at Beaverton. Landon oversaw her training. And so, I still talk to Landon. I see Kate, during the week at school. We're definitely old. That's for sure. Older. And you touched on it earlier. When I was working with you and other athletes, like, we always talked about what was wrong. And, we would have our BS sessions about coaches and, the running speed ladders of 100, 200, 300, 400, so all the kind of nonsense of training. And we would have those sessions. And then I would turn around and think, okay, in order for this to get better, we need to take those negative experiences that you've had as an athlete, how we've talked about it, and then, okay, how do you then go on the positive side to try to change it? Whether it's at a sporting, skill acquisition, a sport coach acquisition, setting up a weekly practice plan. Like, how do we make things better? And my thing always came back to the athlete who's had these, I wouldn't say negative experiences because they can come back to be positive, but in the moment they are bad. How do we make that a positive? How do we change things? And so, as you know, my preaching was meant you guys need to get into coaching in order for it to change. And the legacy, because we used to have great interns, that would come through PTC. You were an intern. Sean Fullerton was an intern. Chris Bova, Brian Highland. I'm probably missing some, and then, the athletes that went through to, get into the field, whether it be as scientists like yourself, technology experts. That's the way things are going to change. And again, to scale, it's, maybe it's 10 or 20 people that have gone out there and changed things for hopefully the better. But then you guys then taking that message to 10, 20, 30 other people, because now you have a bigger exposure to other people that can have influence. And that's how things change. And I've always shared knowledge freely. I learned that from, I think, Louis Simmons, Dave Tate, Jim Wendler, how they gave to me, how Buddy Morris and Tom Myslinski gave their time to me. And so then with you guys and people that came through in the internet, that's how I've always, put it out there to then hopefully make things, better. And, my legacy, this job, at Lake Oswego School District, that's what I want to do. I want to make things better for the athletes coming after. And I tell the kids, we want to be the world's best at what we do. They're not going to give us some medal for it. That's what we should strive for. And that's what keeps me going forward, at 58, 59. And I hope that, when I'm 70 or 75, whenever I, stop doing it, that I even still at that time want to make things better for everybody. So, it's highly enjoyable now. And I have a new, set of motivation for myself, within it. And I still love it. And it's, I joke to myself, I have a 7-day weekend because of the job that I do. So, and, I get to spend time with you, still talking with Landon and other coaches, and man, it's awesome.
Well, it's also really cool to see your coaching tree, if you will, has very deep roots and is still growing and sprouting. So I'm pleased to hear about all the work that's going on at Lake Oswego. Mark, we usually do this over a cappuccino or a latte, every once in a while over a frosty adult beverage, but this is a fun way to shake things up, change things up. Thank you for carving out time today. And I know that you're probably heading to campus in a little bit to continue that work, but I appreciate you taking time out of the middle of the day here. So thank you.
Yeah. I mean, thanks again, Matt. And, thanks for your friendship over the years. I mean, I've learned a ton from you, through our coach and athlete relationship. And, I'm happy for you and Melanie to, be welcoming the first in the Hauk clan. And so, I only wish you and your family the best going forward.
Awesome. Mark McLaughlin, everyone. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, buddy.